Hi everyone, I'm Casey. Today's story is not just about a disastrous misunderstanding, but about the dignity of a woman who spent her whole life building eternal values, only to be betrayed by someone about to become family. Join me as we listen to the words of Mrs. Porter Wood. My small kitchen in suburban New York smells of ginger cookies and cinnamon this morning. I stand there, my hands beginning to show the spots of time, meticulously wrapping a special wedding gift for Nancy and Derek. In the secret drawer of the antique cabinet, a $50,000 check lies neatly beside the platinum brooch, the soul of Technova, that I have kept for 30 years. I only wanted to give them the gentlest start, without flaunting my wealth or old power. I smile, thinking of the happy look on Nancy's face as she walks down the aisle. The front door opens, and Derek's smug laughter rings out, along with heavy footsteps on the hardwood floor. I was about to step out and say hello, but then I froze behind the kitchen door when I heard his voice excitedly talking to someone on the phone. "Yes, Boss Walter will be there. I have arranged everything perfectly." "Nancy?" "She is the ideal wife, except for her mother." "Oh, Mrs. Porter?" He laughs lightly, a dry laugh that makes my heart tighten. "Just think of her as an old attic in my new house, an unemployed widow who knows nothing about this world other than baking. I will introduce her as a poor loser living on benefits, so the boss will see what a tolerant and family-responsible man I am. An unemployed person as a backdrop for a promising sales director. Great, right?" The world around me seems to shake. My hands holding the gift box tremble, each fingertip cold as if I just touched ice from the Arctic. My breath catches in my throat. My chest stings as if someone stabbed a knife straight in. The physical sensation of betrayal is scarier than any words. Derek continues to ramble about managing my presence at the wedding so as not to lose face before the tech elite. He glances across the living room, looking at the photo I took with Nancy with indifference, then goes straight upstairs without knowing I'm standing there, shattered. The darkness in the hallway seems to thicken, enveloping me. I look down at the gift in my hand. That valuable check now suddenly becomes strangely meaningless. I have spent my whole life sacrificing, building, and protecting Nancy. But now, in the eyes of the man about to become my son-in-law, I am just a dead weight that needs to be hidden. The silence of the once warm house is now eerily cold. I walk toward the window, looking out at the dark garden, my once gentle eyes now extinguished, giving way to a bitter realization. So, is that how you see me, Derek? I sit down in the old armchair in my study, where the dim yellow light casts shadows over the mementos of a glorious time I had intentionally tucked away into the past. Derek's words still prick my ears like needles, calling me a poor, unemployed loser. He has no idea that behind this quiet exterior lies a lifetime of storms I weathered, just so Nancy could have the life she leads today. I feel a heavy sadness, a regret for the parts of myself I buried to stay humble for my family. I flip through an old leather notebook, its pages smelling of dust and history. 30 years ago, Technova was not a blue glass skyscraper in the middle of Manhattan. It started in a cramped garage, thick with the smell of machine oil and the sight of unfinished circuit boards. I remember working 16 hours every single day, missing countless nights of sleep to write the first lines of source code that would eventually change the entire industry. When Nancy went to college, I withdrew $200,000 from my personal trust fund so she would not have to carry the burden of student debt, like so many of her peers. Even when I stepped down to let Walter take over the leadership, I quietly left behind 15% of the preferred stock, a fortune worth tens of millions, just to secure Nancy's future without her ever having to worry about fame or profit. But the greatest realization does not lie in the numbers. It is in the pattern of how Derek appeared in our lives. I am beginning to see a heartbreaking cycle where Derek only calls me when he needs business advice that he pretends is accidental, or when he wants to use my old reputation to expand his client network. He was once so sweet, asking for my feedback on his project presentations. But the moment he received his promotion, he ignored my calls for 3 straight months. He views my presence as a mere tool to polish his image as a family man in front of his big boss. Yet he is visibly ashamed when he sees me wearing an old sweater from the 90s. The more I think, the more a fire of indignation burns within me, replacing the sentimental sadness. He is not just insulting me. He is trampling on an entire generation that built the foundation he now stands upon with such arrogance. He views humility as failure and silent sacrifice as a dead weight. Enough, I whispered to myself, my hands tightening around the sparkling Technova brooch. I have remained silent long enough to protect Nancy's happiness, but a man who does not cherish his roots never deserves the sweet fruit of success. It is time for Derek Harrington to see the true face of the world he is trying so hard to climb with his lies. This morning, the sunlight streaming through my bedroom window no longer carries the heavy weight of old worries. I wake up at 6, but not because of a persistent alarm clock urging me to prepare breakfast for someone else or to rush through Nancy's schedule. I lie there for 10 more minutes, just listening to the robins chirping in the garden and feeling the warmth of the soft wool blanket. A strange sense of freedom creeps into my chest, much like the first time I saw a line of code I wrote run successfully on a computer screen decades ago. I walk down to the kitchen and slowly brew a cup of Pete's coffee, just the way I like it, strong and black. It is a stark contrast to the weak coffee Derek always nagged was better for my health. I prepare myself a plate of poached eggs with fresh avocado on a slice of crisp sourdough toast. Afterward, I log into Amazon and finally order the Kindle Paperwhite I had been putting off for so long, because I feared spending too much time on my own hobbies instead of my family. I even visit the Talbot's website and choose a sapphire blue silk scarf, the color I love most, rather than a neutral tone meant to make me look like a modest old lady, as some might expect. After breakfast, I spend the afternoon tidying up the West living room, a space that was always kept empty for special guests, but rarely saw any visitors. I move out the heavy, cumbersome furniture and replace it with a comfortable La-Z-Boy recliner placed right by the window overlooking the rose garden. As my hands touch my dusty old technical books, I suddenly miss the days when I was passionate about algorithms. I pick up the phone and dial Sarah, a former colleague I had not contacted in a long time, while being busy playing the role of a full-time housewife. Her laughter on the other end makes me realize how much I have missed in the world outside. Evening falls peacefully. I sit on the porch, watching the small flames dance in the outdoor fire pit, my mind free from any ripples of anxiety. For the first time in over 40 years, I sit at the dinner table without worrying if the child I raised has eaten or if I have pleased anyone else. The world out there still turns, but the world inside me belongs to me alone. A sense of fulfilling peace envelops me, stronger and more steadfast than ever before. I take a deep breath, and the cool night air of the suburbs tastes sweet. I am ready for what comes next, not as a poor widow, but as myself, Porter Wood. Mrs. Porter's story hits home. Have you spent years meeting others' expectations while setting your own passions aside? Imagine a morning where you only do what brings you joy. Share your story with Casey and our community below. We're here to listen and lift each other up. The peace of yesterday morning was shattered by the unmistakable roar of Derek's BMW engine right in front of my porch. I was pruning some wild roses, my hands still messy with soil, when he stepped out of the car, looking polished in a tailored suit, as if he were preparing to sign $1 million contract rather than visiting his future mother-in-law. I took a deep breath, pushing back the discomfort from the phone call I had overheard the other day, and put on a polite smile. "Hello, Derek. Is it not a workday for you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the sudden flutter of anxiety in my chest. "I wanted to make some time for family, Mrs. Porter," Derek said, his voice as sweet as maple syrup, but his eyes never stopped darting around my wooden house with silent judgment. He held out a small gift bag from the most expensive bakery in the city. "I brought some macarons from La Durée. Nancy said you liked sweets, though I know at your age you should be careful with your blood sugar. But anyway, once in a while probably won't hurt, right?" He laughed, a rehearsed laugh that showed off his perfectly whitened teeth, but the way he looked at my old gardening gloves betrayed the deep contempt hidden within. He stood there, the very picture of modern success, making me feel as though my quiet life was something that needed to be apologized for. We sat down at the dining table. I had only prepared simple tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches in true American style. Derek looked at the plates, frowning slightly, before launching into a long-winded speech about the dinner parties he attends in Manhattan. "You know, at Technova, everything has to be perfect. We don't just sell software, we sell a lifestyle. That is why I am so worried about you." He paused, taking a sip of tea as if carefully weighing his words. "Nancy said you are resting, or, as we call it, between opportunities. I understand. The market today is harsh for people of the older generation. If you are in need, just tell me. Don't let yourself live so modestly like this." I put my spoon down and looked him straight in the eye. "I am fine, Derek. I am satisfied with what I have." He let out a laugh, a sound filled with pity. "Oh, Mrs. Porter, you are so humble. But you have to understand, the upcoming wedding will be attended by Boss Walter, my CEO. He is a legend, someone extremely sharp with small details. I don't want him thinking that his future sales director leaves his mother-in-law living in such lack. Or how about this?" He leaned forward, his voice full of condescending grace. "I have some connections in the administrative department. A light receptionist or clerical position would help you have a little more income and look more active in everyone's eyes. What do you think?" The suggestion felt like a slap, a calculated move to lower my status while pretending to be helpful. Before I could answer, he continued his final move. "And about your wedding dress, I looked at the one you plan to wear. It is too simple. Honestly, it makes me a bit embarrassed. I have pre-booked an appointment at a high-end boutique downtown. You should pick something more elegant, more expensive. Don't worry about the cost. I will pay." I want Boss Walter to see us as a successful family, not a family with a dead weight to worry about. The phrase dead weight was uttered so lightly, yet it felt as heavy as a stone thrown at my face. He was trying to turn me into a display doll to polish his own name, treating my years of experience and my very identity as something that could be bought and managed. I smiled, the kind of smile that if Walter or Sarah saw, they would know it was the moment I was preparing for a spectacular corporate overthrow. "Thank you for your kindness, Derek. I will consider the idea of looking more active. And as for the outfit, I promise to make your boss so impressed, he will never be able to forget it." Derek seemed satisfied, believing he had successfully subdued this poor old woman. He stood up, adjusted his collar, and left with the triumphant air of a man who had just closed a profitable deal. As his car disappeared from sight, I looked down at the Technova brooch in my pocket. Yes, Derek, we will show Walter what real success looks like. The anxiety had completely vanished, replaced by a cold, firm confidence that I was finally in control of the game he didn't even know I was playing. A few days after his visit to my home, Derek invited Nancy and me to an old-fashioned steakhouse in the heart of the city. He claimed it was a way for us to merge before meeting boss Walter. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew this was not about family. The air was thick with the scent of expensive leather, aged Cabernet Sauvignon, and the sharp, rhythmic clinking of crystal glasses. I sat there in my sapphire silk scarf and a simple neutral dress, feeling the weight of the history in the room. But Derek looked at me as if I were nothing more than a stubborn stain on the pristine white tablecloth. He kept checking his Rolex, his face tightening with an impatience that suggested sitting with me was a poor return on his investment of time. He was a man who measured every second in profit, and clearly, I was in the red. "Mrs. Porter, have you looked over the wedding guest list yet?" Derek asked, his thumb flicking rapidly across the screen of his latest iPhone. I did not even have a chance to answer before he continued, his voice dropping into a tone of forced concern. "I noticed you do not have a LinkedIn profile. It is quite awkward, really. In the tech world today, if you do not exist on a professional network, you simply do not exist at all. I have had to tell a few colleagues that you are a classic type, someone who prefers a reclusive life, just so they would not ask too many questions about what you have been doing for the last 30 years. He took a sip of his wine, his eyes narrowing with a calculation that made my skin crawl. He was not trying to protect my privacy. He was trying to erase my history because it did not fit the glossy, modern narrative he wanted to sell. The conversation shifted to the current state of Technova. Derek began to ramble about a cleansing plan he was proposing to the executive board. "We need to cut the dead weight," he said, his voice hardening as his eyes lit up with a cruel sort of excitement. "You know the type. The people from your generation who still worship outdated source code and sluggish workflows. They do not understand AI. They have no idea how to operate in a world where speed is everything. They are just barriers, clinging to the successes of the past like parasites." I felt the blood in my veins begin to boil, but I kept my hands flat on the table, watching the predator across from me reveal his teeth. He had no idea that the very ground he stood on was built by the people he was calling parasites. Nancy tried to intervene, her voice soft and trembling. "Derek, my mother is the one who—" But I gently placed my hand over hers, signaling for her to remain silent. Derek did not even notice the interruption. He was far too intoxicated by his own arrogance. "Even you, Mrs. Porter," he continued, leaning in closer. "You say you are proud of what you have. But do you know how the world really sees you? A widow living in the suburbs, dressing like a retired primary school teacher, completely lost the moment we mentioned cloud algorithms. I honestly feel pity for you. That is why I offered that receptionist position. At least there you would have some utility, some small measure of value, instead of just sitting at home, spending the tax dollars of hard-working young people like me." The space around me suddenly became unnervingly quiet, until all I could hear was the steady, heavy thud of my own heart. I looked directly at Derek, my eyes likely as sharp and cold as the silicon chips I once designed. "You speak of utility and value, Derek?" My voice was low, but it carried clearly through the noise of the crowded restaurant. "Do you truly believe that putting on an expensive suit and using trendy buzzwords is enough to create real value? You call the people who built your foundation dead weight. Have you ever stopped to wonder if those old lines of code were pulled out from under you? What exactly would be left of the empire you are so desperate to climb?" Derek froze for a fraction of a second, stunned by the weight of my words. But his pride quickly rushed back in to cloud his judgment. He let out a dismissive snort, his voice dripping with defiance. "Are you trying to lecture me? Someone who is between opportunities like yourself? You have no right to talk about business here. This is a world for winners, Mrs. Porter. And at this wedding, you are merely a guest invited out of the kindness of my heart. Please remember that when you meet Walter. Do not embarrass me with those obsolete ways of thinking." He signaled for the waiter to bring the bill, with a grand, condescending gesture, as if to prove once and for all who held the financial power at the table. When we walked out of the restaurant, the cold New York air hit my face, making me feel more alert and focused than I had been in years. Nancy clung to my arm, her eyes blurred with tears of frustration and hurt. I patted her hand gently, feeling a newfound steadiness flowing through my veins. Derek had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He had not just insulted me. He had insulted the very dignity of labor and the necessity of gratitude. I watched his perfectly groomed back as he walked toward the parking lot, and for the first time, I felt no sadness at all. There was only the cold, hard resolve of a leader preparing a final judgment. "All right, Derek," I thought to myself. "You want to see a real winner? I will give you exactly what you want, right at the altar." Back at home, I did not bother to turn on the lights. I sat in the darkness of my study, looking out at the distant city lights flickering on the horizon. The exhaustion from the confrontation made my limbs heavy, but my mind was incredibly clear. I opened the drawer and looked at the Technova brooch once more. It sparkled in the shadows, a silent reminder of everything I had built from nothing. Derek thought I was a poor, unemployed widow, a burden to be managed and hidden. He was wrong. He had underestimated a woman who had won in boardrooms filled with discrimination 30 years before he even knew what a career was. His game had ended the moment those words left his mouth. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of resilience fill the void where the pain used to be. Tomorrow, Derek's little play would finally come to an end. That night, after returning from that suffocating steakhouse, I refused to let myself sink into a bed of tears. Instead, I walked into my study and flicked on the desk lamp, letting the soft, warm light spill over the old blueprints and design sketches from my years at Technova. Derek truly thought of me as a dead weight, a relic of the past that had no place in his shiny corporate future. But he was about to find out exactly what happens when a supposedly dead weight begins to move again, with the weight of 30 years of experience behind it. The fragility I felt yesterday had vanished, replaced by a cold, surgical clarity. I was not looking for a petty fight or a way to hurt him just for the sake of it. I was reclaiming my life and shielding my daughter from a man who viewed people as nothing more than assets to be managed or discarded. The next morning, I did not reach for my usual worn-out gardening clothes. I went to the back of my closet and pulled out my camel-colored Burberry trench coat, a classic piece I had kept in pristine condition since the day I walked out of the Technova headquarters. I drove my old but reliable Volvo into the city straight to the Chase Bank branch downtown. I walked through the heavy glass doors with a purposeful stride that I had not used in a long time. The young teller at the front desk looked at me with a mix of surprise and professional curiosity as I requested to speak with the branch manager in the private VIP lounge. This was the world of high finance and deep trust, a world I had helped navigate for decades, and the moment I sat down in that quiet, wood-paneled room, I felt the familiar hum of control returning to my fingertips. As the manager brought up my trust accounts, the reality of Derek's ambition became chillingly clear. I spent the next hour meticulously reviewing every fund I had established for Nancy over the years. I discovered that Derek had cleverly managed to get his name added as a co-beneficiary on several of the secondary accounts, likely under the guise of helping Nancy manage her future inheritance. I did not raise my voice. I simply let out a small, mirthless smile that did not reach my eyes. I instructed the manager to revoke all unauthorized access and return every account to its original state. I signed the documents with a firm hand, the scratch of the pen on the heavy paper sounding like a final sentence. No one has the right to touch the Wood family legacy without my explicit, written consent, I told him, and I could feel the financial ground beneath my feet becoming solid once more. When I returned home, I sat down at the laptop Derek often teased was too complicated for someone of my generation. I did not go to Amazon or a cooking site. I logged into a secure, encrypted email server that I had not accessed in 5 years. My first message was to Walter Klein, the current CEO, and my former business partner. "Walter, it is Porter," I wrote. "I have had a change of heart regarding the ceremony tonight. I want to attend, not just as the mother of the bride, but as the founder of this company. Prepare a spot for me on the official speaker list." My phone buzzed less than 10 minutes later with a call from Walter himself. His voice was thick with excitement, shouting my name as if I were a long-lost hero returning from a war. He told me he was exhausted with the young managers who could only talk about metrics while forgetting the soul of the code, and he promised to arrange everything immediately. For the next few days, a quiet transformation took place. I still spent my mornings in the garden, but every snip of the pruning shears felt more deliberate, as if I were cutting away the illusions Derek had tried to wrap around us. I spent 2 hours every afternoon studying the latest financial reports Walter had sent over, my mind sharpening with every page. The domestic fog that had settled over my intellect for the last few years evaporated, replaced by the same brilliance that had once made me a legend in the tech industry. I began to see the massive holes in Derek's proposed strategy, risks that only someone who had been there at the beginning could truly understand. I began drafting my notes, preparing a speech that would do more than just celebrate a wedding. It would remind the world of the foundation upon which Technova stood. The most delicate part of the plan was Nancy. I invited her over for tea on a late Tuesday afternoon, the air smelling of Earl Grey and the faint scent of rain. I did not use harsh words or try to force her to see things my way. Instead, I simply handed her a folder containing copies of the bank records and played a few recordings I had made during Derek's recent visits, a habit of documentation I had never truly lost from my days in the boardroom. "Nancy, I am not telling you to choose between your mother and your fiancé. I only want you to see the man you are about to give your entire life to. If someone treats their own roots as a dead weight, how can they ever protect something as precious as your future?" Nancy looked at the numbers, listened to Derek's condescending voice on the tape, and I watched as the confusion in her eyes hardened into a fierce, quiet resolve. On the final afternoon before the wedding, I pulled the small crimson velvet box from my dresser. The Technova brooch inside sparkled under the golden light of the setting sun, its platinum and diamonds a testament to every late night and every sacrifice I had ever made. I used a soft silk cloth to wipe away every speck of dust, treating it not as jewelry, but as the ultimate proof of my existence and my intelligence. I also prepared an elegant cream-colored envelope, placing inside it a new check. Not $50,000 to buy Derek's approval, but a private investment into a secure account for Nancy's independent future. I looked into the mirror and saw a 65-year-old woman with noble silver hair and eyes that blazed with the wisdom of experience. I was no longer afraid of Derek Harrington. I was Porter Wood, and tomorrow, the world would be reminded of exactly what that meant. After the long days of building my defenses, I chose to meet Walter at a small cafe hidden behind the maple trees of Central Park. This was the spot where we used to celebrate every time a major Technova project launched successfully. As I stepped inside, the aroma of roasted coffee beans and the soft sound of jazz music made my heart settle. Walter was already sitting there, still possessing the dignified air of a powerful CEO. But his eyes lit up with pure joy when he saw me. "Porter, you look as wonderful as the first day we stayed up all night in that garage," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of decades of shared history. Walter stood up and pulled out a chair for me with a level of respect that I had almost forgotten I deserved over these past few months. "I have read the notes you sent, Porter. It is unbelievable," he whispered. "The solutions you propose for the new security system are so sophisticated that even my youngest engineers would take their hats off to you. You never really retired, did you? Your brain is still the most valuable asset Technova ever had." I felt a warm current of electricity spread through my heart. It was not just about the compliment on my intelligence, but the feeling of truly being seen by an old friend after feeling like a passive shadow for so long. I took a deep breath and told Walter about everything Derek had said, about how he called this dead weight and planned to introduce me as an unemployed moocher at the wedding to impress his guests. Walter fell silent, his hands tightening around his teacup, his face showing a suppressed fury. "He actually said that? Right to your face?" Walter shook his head, his voice trembling with anger. "Derek is a good salesman, but he does not have the soul of a technologist. He does not know that every cent he earns was built on the sweat and intellect of the woman he is intentionally trying to humiliate." Walter placed his hand on mine, a firm grip of camaraderie. "Porter, you do not have to carry this alone anymore. Tonight will not just be Nancy's wedding. It will be a ceremony to honor our greatest founder. I will stand on that stage with you. We will show that Harrington fellow who really holds the keys to the future." I looked into Walter's eyes and saw my own reflection from years ago, steady, confident, and unafraid. The feeling of being alone for so long completely vanished. I knew that no matter how much Derek schemed, he could not win against the truth and genuine friendship. Casey believes that one person standing by your side gives you the strength to overcome anything. Have you had a loyal friend or colleague like Walter? Someone who has valued you for decades? Tell Casey about that special ally in the comments. Let's honor those who never stop believing in us. On the night before the wedding, New York was drenched in a late rain, the sound of water hitting the glass windows sounding like restless, unsettling knocks. After my meeting with Walter, I found my mind strangely sharp and alert, moving with a strategic focus I had not felt in years. I sat in the dim kitchen, the only light coming from the stove, waiting for Nancy in the heavy silence. She had told me she found something important, something she discovered in the leather briefcase Derek had carelessly left at my house this afternoon. I took a slow sip of hot chamomile tea, trying to soothe the icy chill that was crawling down my spine as I anticipated the coming storm. The truth, I realized, is sometimes like a sudden thunderstorm. It must arrive with force to wash away the very last of our lingering illusions. Nancy finally walked into the kitchen, her eyes red and puffy from crying, her hands trembling as she placed a dark blue folder on the table. "Mom, I do not want to believe it, but these numbers do not lie," she whispered in a broken voice, revealing her complete lack of awareness regarding the financial trap being set for her. I opened the folder, and my heart dropped as I realized it was not a business plan or a report for Technova, as he had claimed. It was a draft for a secret prenuptial agreement that Derek had been crafting with his private lawyer, along with bank statements from accounts he had hidden entirely from Nancy. Under the flickering kitchen light, each line of text appeared like an ugly scar on a face that I once thought was perfect. I flipped through the statements with a focused intensity, my business instincts taking over. Derek Harrington, the flashy sales director who had spent weeks lecturing me on financial management and lifestyle, was actually drowning in debt. He had gambled hundreds of thousands of dollars on illegal cryptocurrency exchanges and failed venture investments in the Cayman Islands. There were urgent collection notices sent to a private post office box, showing that he was not a rising star in the tech world at all. He was a debtor, standing on the edge of an abyss, and this wedding was nothing more than the final lifeboat he intended to cling to, so he would not be swallowed by his own failures. But what made my heart truly tighten was a series of handwritten notes tucked into the back of the file. He had meticulously calculated how to convince Nancy to grant him power of attorney over the trust funds I had established for her, effectively planning to steal her valuables. He wrote that after the wedding, he would use my old reputation, if I still had any value left with Walter, to secure massive loans for his schemes. If I tried to interfere or stand in his way, he planned to move me into a nursing home in New Jersey, specifically noting it should be the cheapest one available to reduce his costs. He wrote about the need to isolate Nancy from that old woman's influence, so he could easily manipulate her for his own gain. Reading those words, a surge of nausea and pure disgust rose in my throat. He did not just want our money. He wanted to completely erase my life and turn Nancy into a financial puppet. I looked at Nancy, my daughter, as she sat slumped in the chair, her thin shoulders shaking with every muffled sob of depression and anxiety. All the sweet words, the expensive bouquets, and the calculated gestures of care he had given her were nothing more than a carefully orchestrated script to manipulate her feelings. He was not a man in love. He was a predator, hunting the fortune that the Wood family had built through years of sweat and sacrifice. I felt a sense of absolute clarity wash over me, clearing away every remaining doubt. Derek did not love Nancy. He only loved the prestige of being a Technova son-in-law, a title he thought would save him from his own pathetic reality. I stood up, moved across the kitchen, and pulled Nancy into a tight, protective embrace. In that single moment, all the fatigue of being a 65-year-old widow vanished, replaced by the primal instinct of a mother and a founder who had once faced the fiercest wolves in the business world. I looked at the blue folder, and then at the Technova brooch sitting on the table, a symbol of my enduring legacy. Derek thought I was a poor, unemployed loser who was easy to bully and manipulate because of my age. He made a fatal mistake when he decided to turn my family into a tool for his deceit. I gathered the documents, carefully placing them into my handbag with a cold, deliberate precision. Tomorrow, at that magnificent altar, Derek Harrington is going to receive much more than he ever bargained for. He wanted a grand introduction in front of Boss Walter. I will give him a performance that the entire New York tech scene will be talking about for decades to come, ensuring justice is served. I turned off the kitchen light and guided Nancy toward the stairs. The darkness no longer felt scary or oppressive, because we finally saw through it. "Sleep now, my dear," I whispered, "for tomorrow, the true light will finally return to this house." After Nancy had fallen asleep from exhaustion in my arms, I quietly went up to the attic, the place where the last fragments of a vibrant youth lay. The rain outside had stopped, leaving only the wind whistling through the cracks in the door like a whisper from the past. I searched for the old oak box, tucked deep in the corner of the cupboard. When the lid opened, the familiar scent of wood and old paper rushed in, bringing with it the image of Thomas, the man who had helped me write the first chapters of my life. I picked up Thomas's long-stopped pocket watch. He had been gone from my mother and me for 15 years, but the warmth of his integrity still lingered. I remembered those cold winter nights in Boston, the two of us sitting in our cramped garage, sharing a dry piece of bread to save every penny for computer parts. Thomas never spoke of winning or losing or taking advantage. He would simply take my hand, rough from hard work, and say, "Porter, we're not doing this to become billionaires, but to prove that intelligence and kindness can change the world." Looking at his black and white photo, I suddenly saw how pathetic Derek Harrington was. Derek had $1,000 suits, gleaming cars, but his soul was empty and rotten with greed. He called us deadly burdens, but he didn't realize that it was those very burdens that had been built with sweat, tears, and even blood to create the high platform he now stands on, boasting about. My Thomas, though he didn't take the glamorous title of sales director with him when he left behind a legacy of respect and unconditional love, something Derek could never buy with checks or lies. I pressed his photograph to my chest, feeling a strange peace spreading through me. The pain and anger from Derek's case file now faded, giving way to an unwavering determination. "Thomas, I won't let that man destroy what we've built. I won't let my daughter become a victim of a predator disguised as a successful man. Your silence right now is the strongest answer I can give you." I smiled, my tears no longer bitter, but purified. I put away the wooden box and stood up, my heart completely different. Tomorrow, I will walk down the aisle, not as an unemployed old woman, but as the keeper of the flame of the values Thomas left behind. The strength I drew from Thomas's soft words and the heavy weight of that blue folder was still pulsating through my mind as the sun rose over New York. The next morning, the grand wedding rehearsal began at a lavish hotel in the heart of Manhattan, a place that felt like a fortress of glass and high expectations. The lobby was filled with the cloying, heavy scent of white lilies that seemed to hang in the air, mixing with the deep, somber notes of a cello playing somewhere in the distance. It was meant to feel like a dream of romance, but for me, it felt more like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided before I even walked through the door. Derek found me quickly and pulled me into a private lounge, his hand gripping my arm with a force that was no longer hidden by a polite touch. He stepped inside and locked the door behind us, the sound of the deadbolt clicking into place, echoing like a trap snapping shut. Derek did not bother with his sweet maple syrup act this time. His eyes were cold, and they moved with the sharp clinical precision of a scalpel, ready to dissect a prey he thought was already exhausted. He threw a thick stack of documents onto the mahogany table, and I saw the official red seal of a law firm that I was certain were his co-conspirators. He leaned over the table, his voice dropping into a low, predatory tone that was intended to make me feel small. "Mrs. Porter, let us be honest with each other for a moment," he began, his arrogance filling the small room. "I have been looking closely at your situation, and frankly, it is making Nancy and me very worried. You are living all alone in that big house, with signs of forgetfulness, and your clothes and your way of thinking are just so out of touch with the modern world." He pushed the papers toward me, his finger tapping on a line that read, "Power of Attorney." "This is a total asset management agreement," he said, treating me like a child who could not understand its implications. "It will let me help you with your bills and your property taxes and those little savings you have managed to hold on to. It is truly for the best for everyone in this family." I looked down at the documents, and I felt my hands begin to tremble. But this time, it was not out of fear. It was a raw, burning indignation that made my fingertips tingle. I looked him in the eye and asked what would happen if I simply refused to sign his little contract. Derek let out a sharp, mocking laugh that was filled with a sense of total victory. "Then I will be forced to seek medical intervention," he said, his threat hanging in the air like poison. "In this state, it is not very difficult to prove that a senior person no longer has the mental capacity to manage their own life, especially when that person starts rambling about lines of code from 30 years ago like they are some kind of sleepwalker. I really do not want to see you placed in a high-security nursing home under a conservatorship right after the wedding, Mrs. Porter. Do not let things get ugly before you have a chance to meet Boss Walter." I took a deep breath, and instead of shrinking away, I reached out and pulled the documents toward me. I scanned the dense legal jargon with the same eyes that had once reviewed billion-dollar merger agreements when Technova was just a dream. I felt a cold clarity take over my mind as I pointed to Clause 4.2, a line of text so small, most people would have missed it. "This clause right here," I said, my voice becoming as steady and firm as a rock. "It allows the agent to sell the principal's assets without any notice in case of an emergency. And yet, your definition of an emergency is far too vague to meet the standards of the Federal Asset Management Acts. Derek, where did you learn to draft such sloppy amateur contracts? Or did you truly believe that an unemployed woman would not be able to read a balance sheet or a legal trap?" Derek froze, his mouth hanging open slightly as his brain struggled to catch up with the version of me he thought existed. He had spent so long building a version of me that was weak and irrelevant that he did not know how to handle the reality of the woman standing in front of him. He reached out to snatch the papers back, but I stood up with a poise that felt like it was carved out of granite, the same way I had stood before the board of Technova years ago. "You want to use the legal system to pull me down, Derek? You want to talk about my mental capacity?" I asked, my voice rising just enough to command the entire space. "Do you know that the new cloud security system you are using to impress Boss Walter is actually built on a structural logic that I patented in 1995? If I were to be ruled incapacitated, my estate and all my patents would be frozen immediately, and your entire project would collapse into nothing overnight." His face turned a sickly shade of pale, and his breathing became shallow and fast as the realization of what he had done began to sink in. "You are lying!" he screamed, his voice cracking with the panic of a man who realized his lifeboat was full of holes. All the confidence he had walked in with was gone, replaced by the sheer terror of losing everything he had lied for. He tried to pin me against the wall, his strong arm slamming against the wood paneling, but I did not move an inch. I looked him in the eye and saw not a powerful man, but a terrified little boy who was about to lose his game. "Derek," I said, my voice as calm as the ocean before a storm. "You can push me into a corner, but you can never corner the truth. This wedding will happen, but it will not follow the script you have tried so hard to write." I reached out and gently pushed his arm away, a simple movement that carried the weight of a woman who was no longer afraid of anything. I walked to the door and unlocked it, letting the bright light from the grand hall flood into the dark, stifling room. I stepped out, and there was Nancy, standing just a few feet away, with eyes that were wide with a deep, final disappointment as she looked at the man she almost married. I did not say another word to him. I simply walked away with my head held high, the rhythmic sound of my heels on the polished marble floor echoing through the hotel like a drumbeat of victory. Derek was left behind in the shadows, surrounded by the worthless papers he thought were his weapons. He had forgotten one very important thing. I was the one who built the system he tried to use, and I knew exactly how to dismantle it. Seeing Mrs. Porter's legacy threatened is deeply unsettling. Have you ever felt your life's hard-earned work was being dismissed? Mrs. Porter's resilience proves that your dignity and wisdom belong to you alone. What do you think of her standing her ground? Share your reflections with Casey below. I walked out of that dark waiting room, leaving behind the frantic, shallow breaths of a man who had just tasted his first real defeat. The cello music in the grand hall was still playing its soft, melodic tune, but in my ears, it had transformed into a steady, rhythmic pulse that matched the beating of my own heart. It was a sound that urged me forward. I found Walter standing on the hotel balcony, his eyes fixed on the rushing river of lights that made up Fifth Avenue. He turned as I approached, his face unreadable to a stranger, but clear as day to me. He handed me a sleek black leather folder containing the VIP guest list and the official order of speakers for tonight's wedding. "Everything is ready, Porter," he said, his voice as steady as a rock beneath my feet. He told me that Derek had no idea that the CEO's welcoming speech would feature a very unexpected guest. We stood there for a moment in the cool evening air, two people who had seen the world change many times over, now ready to change it once more. We moved to a secluded corner of the hotel library, a quiet sanctuary filled with the scent of old books and polished wood. Walter opened his laptop and showed me the press release already prepared for Monday morning. He had instructed Technova's legal department to do a deep dive into Derek's personnel files, and it turned out that what Nancy and I had found regarding his personal debts was only the tip of a very dangerous iceberg. He had been using the company name to conduct several unauthorized and questionable transactions, hiding behind the prestige of his title. As I looked through the numbers, my heart tightened with a mix of anger and a strange kind of relief. A man like this truly thought he could push me into a low-end nursing home to seize our family legacy? This moment of justice was no longer just about my own dignity. It was about protecting Technova itself, the spiritual child that Thomas and I had nurtured from the very first lines of code we ever wrote in that cold garage. I opened the small velvet box I had been carrying and took out the platinum brooch. Under the soft glow of the crystal chandeliers, the diamonds sparkled with a life of their own, as if they were waking up after a long sleep. Walter looked at the piece of jewelry with a deep, quiet reverence. He told me that for all these years, he had kept the position of chairperson open for me. He had never let anyone else sit in that seat because he always knew that one day our leader would return. I pinned the brooch onto my dark sapphire silk dress. To someone like Derek, it might have looked like a simple, expensive ornament. But in this room, it was a symbol of absolute truth. It was a silent declaration, but while our generation might grow older, our intellect and our dignity would never become obsolete. We were the foundation, and it was time for the foundation to speak. Nancy walked into the library a few minutes later, looking breathtaking in her ivory wedding dress. But as I looked at her, I didn't see the nervous excitement of a typical bride. Instead, she carried a calm, steady gaze that she had learned from me over these last few difficult days. She whispered that Derek was looking for me, trying his best to act normal in front of the business partners, but you could see his hands shaking every time someone mentioned my name. I took her hand in mine, feeling the strength of the next generation rising to meet my own. I told her not to be afraid, because tonight, there would be no room left for lies at that altar. Walter and I would be standing right behind her, a wall of support that no predator could ever break through. She nodded, and there was a single tear escape and rolled down her cheek. A real smile finally began to touch her lips. The freedom we had been fighting for was finally within reach. The wedding reception began, and the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses filled the ballroom. From behind the heavy velvet curtains of the main stage, I looked out at the brilliant sunlit room. Derek was standing there, a glass of champagne in his hand, and a radiant, practiced smile on his face as he mingled with the guests. He was likely practicing the words he would use to introduce me to Boss Walter as a poor, unemployed widow, using my supposed weakness to highlight his own fake generosity. He still had no idea that the woman he intended to use as a decorative backdrop for his promotion was actually the person who held his entire future in her hands. I took a deep breath, feeling an absolute centered stillness in my soul. The storm was right in front of us, and I was the one steering the ship into the light. "It is time," Walter said softly, offering me his arm. We didn't walk out like a boss and a lonely mother. We walked out like two partners who had built an empire together, brick by brick and line by line. I smoothed the silk of my dress and felt the reassuring weight of the brooch on my chest. Every insult, every condescending remark about my age, and every lie Derek had heaped upon me over the past few months felt like nothing more than dust beneath my feet. I stepped up onto the stage as the spotlights began to sweep across the room. This was not about a petty desire for revenge. This was about putting things back where they belonged and honoring the truth. Tonight, the justice of Manhattan would finally be heard, and its voice would be mine. The ballroom of the plaza was a sea of shimmering silk and the heavy scent of expensive lilies. A space so lavish it felt almost suffocating. I stood in the deep shadows behind the velvet stage curtain, my hand resting firmly on Walter's arm, feeling the steady, grounding strength of a true friend. Out there, under the brilliant glow of the crystal chandeliers, Derek was holding court. He stood on the elevated platform, swirling a glass of vintage champagne, his face flushed with the absolute arrogance of a man who believed he had finally conquered the world. He was looking for me, his eyes scanning the crowd with a predatory focus. And when he saw me beginning to step out from behind the velvet, a small, condescending smirk crossed his lips. He had no idea that the very moment he chose to open his mouth would be the moment the gavel fell on his own future. "Ladies and gentlemen," Derek's voice rang out clearly through the high-end speakers, commanding the attention of every billionaire and tech executive in the room. Before we begin the official ceremony, I want to take a moment to introduce a very special person. This is my future mother-in-law, Mrs. Porter Wood. He gestured for me to step forward into the blinding spotlight. As I stood beside him, Derek wrapped his arm around my shoulder, a fake, chilling embrace that made my skin crawl. "She has lived a very modest life in the suburbs," he continued, his tone dripping with a rehearsed pity. "She is currently unemployed and has been struggling a bit with her health and keeping up with the modern world. But, as you can see, Boss Walter, we are going to take care of her. We have decided to offer her a simple receptionist position at Technova so she can feel useful again. That is how our family operates, with compassion for those who have been left behind by time." A wave of murmurs began to spread across the ballroom like a cold wind. Guests in their designer gowns and tailored tuxedos looked at me with a mixture of pity and uncomfortable curiosity. Derek smiled broadly, looking over at Walter as if waiting for a gold star for his supposed generosity. But Walter did not smile. He did not move a single muscle in his face. Instead, he stepped up onto the stage, the spotlight shifting to focus entirely on him and the platinum brooch that was now blazing like a star on my chest. Walter looked directly at Derek, his voice not loud, but carrying a weight that silenced the entire room in an instant. "Mr. Harrington, did you just say you wanted to find a receptionist position for this woman you claim has been left behind by time?" Walter moved closer to me, and to the absolute shock of everyone watching, he bowed his head slightly in a gesture of profound respect. "Ladies and gentlemen," Walter said, his voice booming with authority, "there has been a disastrous misunderstanding here tonight. The woman our sales director just called a poor, unemployed widow is actually Porter Wood. She is the co-founder of Technova, the brilliant mind who wrote the very first lines of source code for the operating system every single person in this room is using right now. She is not only the largest individual shareholder of this corporation, but she is the woman I have spent the last 5 years desperately trying to convince to return as our chairperson of the board." The ballroom fell into a deathly, hollow silence. The champagne glass in Derek's hand began to tremble violently before it slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor and shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces, much like the fake future he had tried to build on a foundation of lies. He looked at me, then at the Technova brooch, the piece he had once laughed at as cheap costume jewelry, which was now shining as the ultimate seal of power. "No, that is not possible," he stammered, his face turning a sickly, ghostly white. I looked him straight in the eye, feeling no hatred, only the cold, steady clarity of someone who had seen through every mask. "The world of winners you kept talking about, Derek? It is not built on looking down at your elders or calculated greed. It is built on the truth. And tonight, the truth has finally caught up with you." Walter reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder, the same evidence of Derek's secret debts and fraudulent transactions we had reviewed earlier. "Mr. Harrington, due to your severe ethical violations and your calculated attempt to financially abuse a family member, Technova is terminating your contract, effective immediately. All records of your debts and your fraudulent behavior will be handed over to our legal department and the proper authorities for further action." Derek collapsed onto the stage, the borrowed glory of his tailored suit and his high title vanishing in an instant, leaving behind only a pathetic man who had tried to steal a life that did not belong to him. I stepped forward, gently taking Nancy's hand. She was standing there with tears streaming down her face, but her eyes were bright with a fierce pride I had never seen before. I did not choose to destroy Derek with the same cruelty he had intended for me. I looked down at him and spoke with a voice that was calm and final. I will not use my power to punish you the way you plan to isolate and erase me, I said. But you must learn the lesson of respect. Justice today is not about your destruction. It is about protecting my family and the legacy that Thomas left behind. Go now, Derek, and try to find a way to start over with the truth, if you still have any of it left inside you. I turned to Walter, and he smiled, offering me his arm once more. The applause began slowly, a few people at first, and then it erupted into a roar that shook the very walls of the plaza. It was not applause for a billionaire or a title. It was applause for a woman who had stood her ground and protected her dignity against a storm of contempt. I felt the heavy burden on my shoulders completely evaporate, replaced by a light, soaring sense of peace. The crystal chandeliers above seemed to glow warmer and brighter than they ever had before. I tucked my arm into Walter's and guided Nancy off the stage, leaving the darkness of the lies behind us forever. Manhattan did not feel suffocating anymore. As we walked toward the exit, the cool breeze blowing in from the Hudson River tasted like the purest form of freedom I had ever known. It is a late autumn afternoon in New England, 6 months after that fateful night at the plaza. I am sitting in my studio, looking at a photograph Mrs. Porter sent me. In it, she is with Nancy and Walter, all of them preparing Thanksgiving dinner in a kitchen filled with golden sunlight. There is no longer any shadow of deception. Derek Harrington has disappeared from their lives, carrying with him a costly lesson about arrogance. Mrs. Porter's story is a sharp reminder that while money buys status, it never buys dignity or wisdom. For women like us, age is not a burden, but a treasure of experience and strength. Never let anyone, even those closest to you, lower your value just because your hair has turned silver or because you choose a simple life. Always trust your instincts, protect what you have built, and remember that you are worthy of respect, not for what you own, but for the person you have become. How did you feel after hearing this story? Is there an image or word from Mrs. Porter that made you see yourself in her? And what is the biggest lesson you have taken away? Casey wants to hear your thoughts. Please leave your comments below so we can share and heal together. Goodbye for now, and I will see you in the next stories.